Hello, good morning, and a very warm welcome to you from London. If you're in Asia, a very good afternoon, but wherever you are, welcome to you all. You're very welcome here, and thank you for being here. It's good to see so many of you already commenting on the chat, and we look forward to a wonderful webinar this morning. So, one of the reasons for this webinar is the current situation we're in. I myself remember that in February, I was in Singapore, looking forward to coming back within the next couple of weeks. And within a couple of weeks, we all went into lockdown. Now, one of the things in education lockdown has done is that it's clearly defined the need for blended learning and for digital skills. And I think in the last 6 months, we've probably done more for that than we have in the last 6 years. So whilst EdTech has been good in terms of continuing learning during this COVID period, the question really remains about its real impact. And when you think about that in terms of the statistics that are coming out, they're quite stark. The Education Development Trust in the UK, for example, has said that the last 6 months equate to almost 1 year of learning loss. If you look at the number of children that will drop out of education because of the economic factors, that's between 7 and 10 million. That's quite significant. And UNICEF recently published a paper that said that 9 to 11-year-olds that had dropped out of school were between 11 and 43% less likely to achieve the same foundational reading skills as those who had stayed in school. So all of these are really stark statistics, and they tell you something about the problems that we face in terms of education. But now we're at a crossroads. We know that there is vaccines coming. We know that they have some efficacy. But we also know that that might take time and the pandemic rages. I mean, London, for example, is still in lockdown until today. So in light of this, how do we look at the challenges that we faced? We have governments trying all sorts of methods to meet these challenges. We see that there are infrastructure barriers across Asia Pacific and other developing countries. We see that blended learning has evolved in many ways. Is that here to stay? Is that the new normal? And eventually we'll need to get an economic recovery going. Do we actually have the skills to make this happen? Fortunately for us, we have an expert panel who are going to answer these questions for you. And I'm delighted to welcome them all today. So if I can start with Dr. Sungsup Ra from the Asian Development Bank. Dr. Sungsup is the South Asia Human and Social Development Division Director and also the chair of the Education Sector Group at the ADB. As the director, he oversees a portfolio of $5 billion in South Asia, and as chair, he provides strategic leadership to the Education Sector Group and coordinates the overall work plan. Welcome, Dr. Sungsup. Very good to have you here. Next, from Microsoft, we have Dr. Rani Birchmore. Dr. Birchmore leads sales strategy and programs as the APAC K-12 Education Director. She's based out of Singapore and works with APAC Ministries of Education for transformational change in the way that technology is used for learning and how it is maintained. Welcome, Dr. Rani.
Hi.
From NTT Data, I'm delighted to welcome Ridwan Othman. Hi, Ridwan. And Ridwan is currently the head of education business unit at NTT Data in Singapore. He's also responsible for the end-to-end customer success cycle using next-gen technologies, which include AI and adaptive learning. I'm also delighted to say that both Learning Possibilities and NTT signed a partnership recently, and we look forward to working together. And finally, from the UK government's Department of International Trade, I'd like to welcome Vipul Bhargava. Vipul has, for the past 5 years, been a special advisor in education technology and international schools at the Department of International Trade. And this is the department that helps UK businesses export, drives inward and outward investment, negotiates market access and trade deals. So thank you for being with us today, Vipul. Now, in terms of the format for today, we are going to let each of our panelists talk about their specific topics and then have a discussion. On the, many of you have already discovered, there is a chat function and the panelists can see the chat as well. We will be putting some of those chats up on the screen. So feel free to contribute, ask questions, make comments. I would ask that you put your name and where you're from so that the panelists can see that as well. And so let's begin. Let's talk a little bit about some of these challenges. If you think about funding, the ADB is one of the biggest funders in the region. And during this time of pandemic, I know that they've been reaching out to many governments to assist them in their plans to tackle the learning issues during COVID. So can I start by introducing Dr. Sungsupra and asking him, what are the priorities for ministries of education and how are they tackling COVID during this pandemic? Dr. Sungsupra.
Thank you, Mio, asking. Initially, COVID-19 was seen as like more of the health, economic and social safety crisis rather than education crisis. Education wasn't the immediate priority of the Ministry of Education. Schools were forced to close without much preparation. But now, the nearly 9 months into the lockdown, there are 4 key priorities that are common to most of the MOE have emerged. The first, ensuring school continuity. This is for immediate priority given the most teacher and learner will still lack access to the connectivity required. The second, using education technology for school coverage and also improving learning. COVID-19 is a wake-up call for government to increase effort to facilitate education technology use. The pandemic has made education technology akin to a necessity. Third, enhancing teachers' digital competence and ability to teach in virtual environment. School closure and learning from the home have the re-emphasis the crucial of teacher, supporting teacher for digital skill and effective teaching virtually become a top agenda of the Ministry of Education. Fourth, developing and implementing a reopening strategy with hygiene and social distancing measures. Schools have moved across the varying stage of the school closure and also reopening. Recurring waves of the virus also compel government to adopt a flexible reopening strategy. On your questions on how COVID is being tackled, I would say most governments are still in the response phases with some effort to move to the recovery phases. First, I think the TV broadcasting and radio broadcasting are most prevalent channels, since the access to the digital infrastructure and internet connectivity is quite limited in the region. And it is sort of a low-hanging fruit. In urban area, with better internet connection, a mix of the offline and online strategy are being utilized. For example, live streaming and recorded lessons. ADB is supporting countries to tackle impact of the COVID-19 through a new project, as well as repurposing ongoing project for better response and recovery. For example, in Philippines and Armenia, grant funding is being used to procure radio device, learning material, and prototype of the tablet-based online learning, and develop e-learning platform and digital contents. In India, Meghalaya states, free internet connectivity has been provided to schools and teachers. In Sri Lanka, a new 400 million program support mapping of the availability of technology for online, TV, radio, printed learning material, etc., and development of curriculum and material for branded learning. In Cambodia and Indonesia, ongoing projects support use of the branded learning for teacher training through provision of the ICT infrastructure. For example, installation of the video conference equipment. And we do some capacity also development for teacher and also school director for online teaching and learning. Thank you, Miho.
Thank you, Dr. Sungsup. Before I open this up to the panel, I wanted to just ask a little bit about connectivity and how important it is and where it doesn't exist. Radio and TV are being used as low-hanging fruits to deliver education, and I've seen some of that myself. The question is that is the key here to build public-private partnerships, especially with telecommunications companies, and using the existing mobile bandwidth that exists to kind of meet this need and bring connectivity quickly to areas?
Miho, can I come in first?
Yes, please.
The many governments have forged the partnership with the private provider to offer online or distance learning. For example, Ministry of Education in Cambodia has forged some partnership with Microsoft, Google, and other similar companies. Perhaps maybe you are the one who partner to learning possibility, support classroom teaching, and also in-service and pre-service teaching, teacher training. Similarly, in Sri Lanka, Ministry of Education partners with Microsoft again to provide micro office platform for 3,000 schools. Indian also state of the Gujarat also received the support from the various edtech company. Given the, I would say, challenges, government faced a lot of problem in terms of the ensuring coverage and also the quality coverage. So therefore, PPP definitely need to be expanded to ensure high quality teaching and learning on national-wide scale. But as you mentioned, there are two challenges, I would say. The poor digital infrastructure. That's posed a big challenge to the country. I think this is the way perhaps that the ADB type of institution can more play a role. Second, in some country, maybe since most of you from private sector, you know that public sector is the major, I think, education provider. So the buy-in from the government on private sector partnership is really important. Thank you.
And just to add to that, Dr. Sungsup, with a lot of telecommunications companies coming to the aid of education by offering bandwidth, how important do you think it is for these companies to offer bandwidth to online resources and online platforms and tools for free to make sure that the cost of bandwidth isn't a barrier here?
Yeah, I think thanks for your questions. I know that the many of the country, also most of the school, they don't have access for internet because two reasons: they are not connected to the internet. Second, they don't have the recurrent budget to pay for internet services. So I think the private sector is offering for bandwidth free. They will definitely boost the adoption of the ICT rapidly. Thank you.
Mehul, can I share a little bit comment here?
Yes, please, Ruan.
So I think in regards to what Dr. Sung Suk and you guys were talking about what are the priorities for the government, I think one thing that Dr. Sung Suk touched upon regarding professional development for educators to me is key. Even before COVID, the lack of digital fluency from the teachers themselves is one barrier to allow for digital learning in the proper way to be ubiquitous and to be effective. And with COVID right now, there was a recent report by UNESCO that says pedagogy becomes or turn into panic-gogy, where a lot of the teachers are having challenges trying to do the same kind of effective teaching and learning from home. Parents themselves are unprepared for distance and homeschooling. And there's a challenge, not just what you're talking about bandwidth, but also in terms of what's the correct pedagogy to ensure effective learning is happening and not, a lot of my nephews and nieces sitting down, watching the screen and doing something on their phone and not actually paying attention to the teacher. So these are actual challenges that I think government should also look into equipping teachers, not just with the technology, but also with the right training, and also not forgetting assessment, which I'll talk about later. But that's just my sort of comments. Thanks.
Vipul, can I bring you in here?
Yes, thank you, Mil. Dr. Sung Suk, Ridwan, very, very interesting points. I think for me, the other big point, which we haven't quite talked about just as yet, is of course, different governments across the world are reacting differently. But within countries as well, you have a challenge of the attainment gap. So one of the things that COVID has done, which I feel quite strongly about, is the attainment gap. Some students within the countries have access to better devices, better internet connectivity, so their learning has probably been less impaired. But students who have less access to devices, internet, etc., they're being impaired more. So the attainment gap, which has always been there, has become more during COVID. So one of the big challenges for the governments across the world is going to be, how do you make sure that that gap needs to be reduced, and how do you do that? And I think that's a real challenge, and not just for any one country, it's across the world, in my opinion.
I think you raise a very interesting point there, Vipul. And just to add to that, there was December 2020, so incredibly recent, report by the United Nations that said that 1.3 billion school-aged children, so put that into perspective, that's a staggering 2/3 of all 13 to 17-year-olds out there in the world, can't log into the internet at home. And when you think about that, I mean, that's not a small gap. I mean, that's a Grand Canyon in terms of the gap that there is. And that affects both participating in the modern economy, but in the learning gap that you talk about, because it prevents good learning from home, and, in terms of equity, it increases the gap that there is. So with that thought, let me introduce our next expert panelist, Dr. Rani Birchmore from Microsoft. Microsoft are well known for their focus on infrastructure, connectivity and devices, online resources. But as Ridwan mentioned also, teacher confidence, because that is key. And given where we are, how practical is it to assume that schools will be able to put these things in to be able to effect learning from home during this time? Dr. Rani.
Hi, Dr. Mahul. Extremely excellent question. So let me maybe almost in summary to what has already been spoken about, let me cover a couple of things. I think what COVID has made us observe is that one-to-one computing, which is, we've talked about always in this industry, has become like an absolute requirement, essential requirement for hybrid learning. The business world already has gone through its evolution towards hybrid working, from mainframe server rooms to desktop computing, then laptops, and now finally mobile computing with almost any device with reliable connectivity. I think COVID is forcing education to catch up with this paradigm. And not just because hybrid working is what schools need to prepare our students for, but the lockdown challenges has also highlighted that shipping the right learning devices is just a start. But usability and management of those devices, the access to the orchestrated learning experience with content that is personalized for hybrid learning should be the ultimate goal. And not just for some teachers and students, or even most, perhaps in much of the same way that every student has a chair to sit at school, this needs to be, like the panelists are talking about, have to be accessible to everyone. We need to ensure that there is equity in the access to learning content, not just devices, without exacerbating the urban regional divide. During the last 8 months, some very innovative in-time solutions have emerged or evolved. And as the panelists say, in several countries, they leverage TV white space to reach students and teachers, creating actually huge opportunities to rethink the way TV white spaces are traditionally one way to delivering the content in a collaborative environment. There's huge opportunity for us to do that, to address that. We are also witnessing ministries of education having very deep engagements with telecommunication providers, device suppliers, and not just that, learning platform providers like yourselves, Dr. Maho, where these conversations need to go up the value chain a little. So this is driving, as we see, a growing awareness and acceptance that there are limits to localized solutions to hybrid learning, which is actually a national problem, right? But the great thing is the awareness has added a bit of rigor to projects that leverage specializations, and in terms of skills, including the teachers, and resources being pushed up the provision chain to be more centralized. Ultimately, for primary and secondary schooling especially, broadband black spots and device distribution, or drowning in identity management, LMS administration, or curriculum design should not be left to solve at the school level. Where technology has been chosen and deployed because it's the best solution and not simply because it's within the reach of the school's budget, we are seeing some of the best transformations. For example, let me think, we see some very tangible results with the Tencent project in China and the Department of Education projects in Philippines, where whilst they are very complex solutions, we are seeing examples of very equitable technology resources and skills access for teachers, which is being prioritized as we speak. The biggest call out for me has been the teachers across the region. They've gone through amazing transformation during COVID, especially accelerated transformation. They've really leaned in to create and co-create non-traditional resources with some great results as a community, as a teacher community. Many still lack the confidence, though, in systems and technologies that hybrid learning is totally dependent on, as the panelists are talking about. They need usability skills to tailoring learning content and to help this and support students to ultimately learn from it. Everything else should be lifted off their shoulders. The tech should just work so that teachers can just teach. Not because we should, but because with digital education we can. So a lot of the teachers themselves have done self-learning through their own communities to create, feeling, from the tension of being purposeful and adding value during these really challenging times. They themselves have picked up the pace on what they need to learn a lot of the times to serve their student community, but working with the other teachers in the teacher community.
Rani, thank you for that. One point I'd like to just pick up on that you mentioned before we move to the panel is teacher development. And we know from the past 25 years that teacher development has been one of the key challenges in adopting and embedding technology in schools. How do you make teachers confident enough to use that technology well and actually get a positive outcome from it? And now that we're trying to do it in this scenario where, children might be at home, teachers might be at home, or in some kind of hybrid learning model, how do you accelerate that and how do you make that a reality?
We are seeing the acceleration already, Dr. Mahul, in real life. I mean, it's not widespread, but they're doing it. Teachers, for example, from a Microsoft perspective, we've got this program called the Microsoft Innovative Educator Program with the Microsoft Innovator community that we've got hundreds and thousands of teachers come together to work on. So the best way that we are finding is the training of the teachers need to happen the same way we would train the students, right? Using the technologies, using the tools to teach them in bite-sized pieces and making sure that training is available in time when they are creating those lesson plans, when they are creating classroom content, when they have to go online and search for that content. So all of these, the training materials and the training resources to train them need to happen from a centralized place and for them to be able to access it. And I think this is where the teaching resources is very unlike the student resources that we put a lot of time and effort in creating a learning management platform or a learning platform or content repository. That doesn't change for the teachers. I think traditionally what we've done is brought teachers into a classroom environment to teach them how to do digital education. Now we are forced to look at them and saying, use the technologies to teach the teachers. Engage them at that level where they are going to get an expertise or level of skill when they go into the classroom. And that's the only way to do it.
Ridwan, can I bring you in at this time? I can see a lot of interesting questions in the comments chat. Perhaps you'd like to pick this up as well?
Sure. I think I'd like to combine what you just asked, Ani, and also a question from somebody which was focusing on talking about how e-learning authoring tools that's available should also be some that allows for good quality content. In combining the two, training in terms of, at least from my 22 years experience of actually training a lot of teachers and educators, it's not just focusing on the what and the how of the technology, but the why and the when. The why is actually addressing the reason, the advantages, the affordances of what's the benefit to my students' learning and how my teaching can be better. The when is how can I integrate all these different technology into appropriate times in the classroom. And in regards to the authoring tool, I think beyond the authoring tool, learning design comes a lot, especially when you're talking about e-learning or blended learning, because e-learning and digital learning, it amplifies bad teaching and bad pedagogy. And you need to really put your attention about the learning design, how you use the different tools in different ways at different times in order for you to really ensure engagement, collaboration in the digital space too.
It's interesting that you say that, and perhaps let's move on to the next bit, because I read a recent report from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, an NGO, as you know, and what they were saying is that they believe that the future of education from now on will be the hybrid model of learning. So, Ridwan, if I can ask you, what is the difference between blended learning and hybrid learning? These terms are always used interchangeably. And secondly, with that, in London, in the UK, the first casualty of this pandemic was exams, assessments. And, that becomes obviously very difficult when people are sitting at home, children are sitting at home. We're used to them having them in a hall and writing papers. So how do you do effective assessment scalably across countries? And given that skills is now such an important part of all of this, how do you assess skills?
Okay, so I'll tackle the term hybrid learning first. A little bit of background. Just about 7 months ago, when the COVID just started, a few IHLs in Singapore, and we were having discussions, and they were saying, I was asking them, what's your greatest pain now? What's your greatest pain? And all of them, every single one of them come back. Ridwan, I have rooms, I have seminar rooms, I have lecture theaters in my school, but for example, I have this seminar room that can seat 50, but now I can only seat 25. 25 has to be at home. So how do I ensure inclusive, engage, the same kind of experience for both students at home and students in the campus? So This is in relation to the key difference between hybrid learning and blended learning. Blended learning usually focuses on asynchronous content with some face-to-face content and with some synchronicity that is built into the LMS. Hybrid learning focuses on both aspects, but much more on the synchronous part of it. There's a lot of synchronous learning happening together for students at home and for students in school. And one of the key things is that it must allow lecture and instruction, allow back and forth between students at home and teacher and students in class, allow collaboration between these groups, allow asynchronous content and digital resources, allow virtual facilitation and management. This last part is actually the key. After so many virtual classes that I've conducted, you realize that virtual classroom management is key in order to ensure the learning happens in the hybrid learning space. So that's why hybrid learning is slightly different from blended learning. But in order to do effective hybrid learning, you must have scalable, secure cloud technology that integrates well with the front-end systems like LP+. Also, the exam system is very key because if not, student and teacher experience is not seamless. And then going on to the second point, of course, we cannot forget that actually the focus is not just on learning, it's also about assessment. NTU, for example, come back to me, Ridwan, now with COVID, I need to do a lot of e-assessment, but how do I ensure that the person taking the assessment is actually the person taking? The security is the key issue here. So students will learn the way you assess them. If there's no change to the assessment, the changes that you are actually doing from hybrid learning will not happen because the assessment is still focusing on regurgitation. So authentic assessment can be done in two ways for skills. One is using immersive technologies like AR and VR, where you can use the good rubrics as XR and plus scenario building using parameter changes, where you can actually diagnose students' ability to react to certain problems. I'll give you an example for hospitality and management. Before COVID, before all this technology, people can only do it in a room and they set up a certain scenario. But with XR, you can change parameters like that in an instance. You can create multiple scenarios easily. That's how you authentically assessment. Another key one will be using e-portfolios. Tracking students' journey throughout their school life will actually allow also you to monitor their skills across the learning and not just in terms of the content knowledge in exams, but also in terms of the application knowledge and skills application.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we're seeing more and more demand for e-portfolios as a way to give teachers, a body of work to assess. But let me ask you this, and then I'll move on to the panel. If you look at what we were discussing about teacher readiness, which is critical, the other aspect of that is that we see, so many mental health issues amongst learners. When you take them out of a school environment, out of a social environment where they have friends, relationships, and look at school as, something that a lot of them look forward to going to. How do you tackle that in an online world?
It's interesting you say that because one of the predictions for Edu in 21 from a report is that the isolation issue of FOMO and FOBA, fear of missing out, fear of being alone, is going to be amplified if remote learning is not conducted well. So one thing that to be able to do this well is to ensure social aspects of learning, even in the hybrid learning world, is not lost. Collaborative activity, breakout activities that need students to talk to each other, collaborate, present, even in the, of course, tools like Teams and all that allows for that to happen already. And the teachers need to be able to use this kind of tools in the right manner to allow not just for self-directed learning, but collaborative learning activity, so that this social isolation that can come with very, very badly designed digital learning will actually exacerbate the mental aspects of things. So this will be one way to overcome it.
So Dr. Sungsup, if I could bring you in here, does the ADB see the hybrid learning model as the future going forward from here? Are we going to be carrying on with this mixture of partly being in school, partly being at home? A lot of workplaces talk about this now, working from home as becoming the normal and only going in when you need to. Is learning going to change in this way?
If you're looking at, can you hear me?
Yes.
5 year or 10 year down the road, this would be one reality that we are talking. Many developing countries already talking about blended learning. They need to further go to the hybrid learning. This is extremely important, not just only addressing the COVID-19, these emergency cases. The future, we are talking about lifelong learning. The hybrid learning has a lot of potential for make it the lifelong learning happen. So it's an extremely important area. But I want to add one small thing. I think we are talking about internet, we are talking about access to the hardware. But I start to realize not just only those, we talk about even content. Most important is about people. We need a buy-in from people. People meaning teacher. We talk about parents and policy maker and community whole. We need the support from them to really transform education. This is most difficult. I think Rani mentioned about Microsoft and the Project Excellence. Oftentimes, teachers think that the digitalization means extra burden to them. So we have to really help them so that they don't see this as extra burden. Thank you.
Can I make a comment here, Dr. Mahul? When my son was home from school, learning from home, one of the things that I realized is that as parents, we become an integral support system for hybrid learning by default, right? And when you think about the content and the skilling that happens, we often think about the teacher as the only person who is involved in that teaching process. So systemically, content and resources and all of those is developed around the teacher for the students. I think one of the things that has happened very clearly is governments have to take a conscious effort and build the parent development and the skills integrated into the learning portfolio, because right now a lot of the developed world gives access. When my son gets on a bus, when he gets off a bus, when he finishes an assessment, I get notified of all of those things. But that we use to then help him be active and excited about the work that he's doing, self-directed, right? And for that, parents also need to be part of that skilling process. And I think that's what resonated very, very much for me when I think about the ecosystem that Dr. Sangsap was talking about.
Absolutely. And just picking up one of the questions from the comments, Vipul, people are talking about exam systems currently focused on memorizing books or content and then, just reproducing them. If we're going to move towards things like e-portfolio and measuring skills, how easy is that transition going to be in terms of the way we use exams to transition between school and university and so on? Is this the way to do it?
Yeah, actually, if I can just take that question a little bit higher up, actually. We've talked a lot about blended learning, about how we learn, right? So need for one-to-one computing, need for devices. What we haven't focused the conversation on is what we're teaching. We're still teaching, things that we were being taught over the last 20 years or so, right? So I think this is a really important point in time where we are at a crossroad, but also what we teach. The big challenge I see with the attainment gap that I talked about earlier is that students are going to come out. The attainment gap, when they come out of school, the jobs that we've been talking about that will not exist, that don't exist today, new jobs will be created. How will they be ready for that, right? So the question, and it's a great, really good opportunity we have today, is to change the way we teach children, but also what we teach children. And that has an impact on not only on teaching, but also assessment, as you talked about.
If you think about that in terms of, one of the things we spoke about, which is that the key out of this is not just going to be education, but the economic recovery that we're going to need, because so many countries have spent so much in trying to, shield us from COVID and build appropriate infrastructure and so on. In that scenario, how important does blended learning and skills become, and how do you get the right skills into the learners so that they're ready for employment?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mehul. Thank you for that. Look, I think the biggest thing, we've all talked about health and recovering from COVID. I'm absolutely confident that next year the conversation is going to be around economic recovery, right? Without a doubt, across the world, right? If we just look at UK alone, we're talking about almost 14% unemployment in the ages of 16 to 24. If we look at the hardest hit sectors, which are retail, leisure, airlines, etc., that number goes up to 69%. Right. So we've always talked about robots replacing jobs, etc. But what COVID has done has just accelerated job losses in certain sectors, right? And then you look at public debt, right? So public debt today, this year, is forecasted to be higher than it's ever been. It's higher than the financial crisis by about 100 billion. How are the governments going to pay for this, right? So one of the things that governments are going to talk about across the world are going to be cut to services. But the other thing that's happened in COVID has become very clear is that healthcare and education are probably the two biggest pillars of any society. So there can be cuts in other areas of services as long as governments are clear that the cuts don't come from education. Because education is going to be an absolute pillar for that economic recovery. And blended learning, for me, it's almost not even a discussion anymore whether blended learning is the future. It absolutely is, right? It should have been a long time ago, but now it's just accelerated. So blended learning is learning. There is no more blended learning, right? That's what it is. Again, it's all going to come down to the next year. There's going to be economic recovery, and I absolutely believe that education is going to play probably the most important role on the road to recovery for most countries.
And can I just follow that up and ask, what skills do our children need? And how do you think that this model of blended learning delivers those skills?
Yeah, again, a great question, and some colleagues at OECD, etc., have done some fantastic work around that, right? So I think the skills that we aren't talking about, which are our critical thinking, leadership, working in teams, etc., right? So those are the kind of skills that currently we are not teaching enough, not talking about enough, but the skills that are going to be absolutely critical moving forward. So I think those are the areas. Of course, STEM, everyone's talking about STEM, and we've all figured out ways to get STEM education to people, and we also figure out, and it's super important. But it's the other skills that we aren't talking about that I think will play a critical role.
So Dr. Rani and Ridwan, both Microsoft and NTT are big global employers. And you manage a lot of people. When you are recruiting today, graduates, what skills do you look for? Dr. Rani?
Dr. Rani, you want to go first?
Thank you, I will. Surprisingly, it's all of the skills that Dr. Vigul talked about, right? It is about computational thinking, it's about creative thinking, it's about teamwork. It's a lot to do with the soft skills. And then for the role, whether they have the technical skills, not just to be able to say, oh, you have a certificate in a particular technical discipline, but how we will use that discipline within a collaborative team environment, both in person and virtually. So all of those skill sets are what we are predominantly looking for somebody to be problem solving and creative thinking and thinking outside the box. Because to your point, those are the skills that we need, that we can move people into any of the roles that they can passionately do. And it's not about hiring somebody just for the role, but hiring somebody that can be with you and learn and continue to grow within that role or outside of that role, anywhere in the organization. So to hire, we are actually really knuckled down and focused on that ability to think outside the box and learn as they go on the job.
So Ridwan, just picking that up, when you at NTT are hiring fresh students or graduates, do you see that they have this skill, thinking outside the box, or is that something that you have to spend time and develop with them?
I think it's always been common, not just at NTT, and when I was in previous employment, when I'm trying to hire, I think one of the key things that we're always trying to find, and there's a bit of lack there, is improving, is the ability to problem solve, problem find, and also having the grit. Because grit, through many research have shown that it's the single biggest indicator of later success in life. If you are able to have resiliency, the ability to go through, of course, all these additional 21st century skills that's been defined by UNESCO, OECD, and all that, that's important. But in my own experience, 3 things: being able to problem find, not just problem solve, which means you anticipate problem before it even happens. Having the resiliency and grit, and last but not least, having the adaptability. Because right now in Industry 4.0, and especially with COVID, it's not change is the only constant, it's rapid change is the only constant. So these 3 will be the key things that we look out for in graduates. It's becoming better now with better approaches in terms of selecting and filtering great candidates, and also understanding that transferable skills are important. It's not just technical skills, but also these transferable skills.
So Dr. Sung, sorry, go on, please.
No, I was just going to say that the other point on assessment that Ridwan's talking about, and the skills that Ridwan and Dr. Rani talked about, is right. So far, if you notice in education, we focused a lot on teaching children math, English. So we've been teaching at them and never really worried about how does a child learn, right? And I think one big change in assessment that will and should happen is to understand how children learn. Everybody learns differently. And we haven't, because of lack of technology, we haven't been able to address the different learning needs across different people, right? So what I believe is going to change, and we'll see new technologies come in, is to assess children individually on how they learn. And so the love of learning isn't lost, which unfortunately in today's one-size-fits-all model, it tends to happen.
I'd just like to add to Vipul's point there, because in Singapore, we did started, because I think it's not just the technology, it's also the rubrics that reward certain behaviors. If you're only rewarding regurgitation, memory, that's what's going to happen. Students will learn the way you assess them. So if you have rubrics coupled with, like what you said, now technology is coming up, like AI, proctoring tools that allows for such personalization of those learning assessment, it can easily be done now. Before, it can be a bit of challenge in terms of logistics and all that. But I agree with you.
So just to bring Dr. Sungsup in here, when we look at things like e-portfolios and assessing skills, I mean, that is a long-term, measurement of the journey and how they've improved during that journey. How important is skills and putting skills into learners, Dr. Sungsup, when you deal with ministries in APAC? Is that high on their priority list?
You mean the skills?
Yes.
Okay. In fact, this is a high priority. I see the big change in terms of the education landscape over last, I say, 10 years. We know in 1990 there was a setback in terms of the skills development. I mean, particularly I'm referring vocational education. But now this is a country, they wanted more vocational education. They want to introduce vocational education to school education. This is very, very, I would say, big change happening, not because of the education theorists proposing this. It's come from the developing country themselves. They see skill is now the very important component, should be component for the school education, not only for technical vocational education institution. But how we do that is very challenging because of the some countries like Sri Lanka, in the secondary education, they are introducing technology stream called like vocational education stream. But there's a couple of issues. Number one, that it's very difficult to find out teacher. Where you get teacher for that. Second, content, we're talking about that, right? Now, a skill development sector, they're more affected by COVID-19 because you cannot have in-class education there. So compared to even formal school education, there's no, I think the training is possible in the Tibet side. So hope that the education sector, we have also further progress so that we can even find out the business continuity plan further, even the Tibet institution also. But also when we talk about skill now, whatever learn now, not necessarily last long. It's just only less than 1 year, even less than 5 years, it will be obsolete. So it's quite important to really we can balance fundamental skill, the foundation skill with the vocational skill together, specific skill. Ridwan and others also mentioned about the critical thinking, problem solving skill, teamwork, also emotional one. You talked about greed also. Teamwork is extremely important. But another thing I start to look at it across the education sector, we need really invest more. I think the people mentioned that on the how to learn, because thanks to the development of the learning science, we start to understand under that black box how the student can learn. On the learning process with the digitalization, we can on real time can also understand how the student can learn. So hope that the future we have more investment, more researchers to be done. In that area we have more breakthrough, so that want to help. Particularly students require more the help and support. Thank you.
So we have, I can see so many comments around, and a lot of them are around, the worries that people have around online and digital learning, lack of access, or where students have learning difficulties, or how do you train teachers to achieve this. So I'm going to put all of you on the spot now, and assume that you are here to advise all of the people who are making comments, all the ministries out there, all the schools. We are, as I said at the outset, at a crossroads. We have, on the one hand, this pandemic, and on the other, we have the promise of a vaccine. But we don't know yet whether that means everything will be back to normal or not next year, or even longer than that. So if you were advising these ministries and schools, what would your goals and your priorities be for next year? And what is your forecast of what is going to happen and how they should deal with this? And I'm going to start with Dr. Rani.
Okay, so I'm going to make a prediction.
Absolutely.
I think what was at first a struggle for teachers to protect learning outcomes is becoming a battle for nations to protect their future GDP. That's how serious it is. So most countries already have centralized ICT policies, but the urgent need for one-to-one computing and access across entire nations is going to create the economies of scale necessary to centralize even the distribution and administration of the technology and the resources. There's going to be centralized procurement to think about how content is created, and this is going to be expedited. And I think the end-to-end view of creating something, distributing it right down to the teacher-student level, and then funneling all of that information up to talk about personalized learning is going to be the next thing that is going to happen. And that's going to happen purely because of economies of scale that COVID has pushed the countries into.
Thank you so much. Ridwan, can I ask you the same question?
Okay, so I have just three predictions, and also I think concerns that I think needs to be mitigated. One is that personalization of education using adaptive technologies such as AI, analytics, and being able to integrate with ML will be developed further, and with real application and support by many, since it can help remove the ambiguity of remote and digital learning. For example, AI in assessment, in providing personalized help and guidance via chatbots, and for e-proctoring will rise. Secondly, I feel that cloud and SaaS solutions for education will also be rising to reduce footprints in institutions to ensure scalability, also in terms of energy and sustainability. But last but not least, I think one concern that I think everybody has is that issues of equity and access to good technology and bandwidth has to be anticipated and mitigated. They call it the Matthew effect, that those who are most able to benefit from the introduction of technology are indeed the ones who actually benefit the most. So we need to really be cognizant of this and to see how technology, together with government policies, together with providers like all of us, work together to ensure equity and access to all.
Thank you, Ridwan. Vipul, can I ask you the same question?
Sure. I think the best way to have any prediction is to have lots of predictions. So one of them will be right at some point, right? So I'm going to quickly go through what I think is going to happen, right? I think the next year is going to be the year of catch-up. Students will be left behind. I think governments are going to focus on ensuring that the attainment gap reduces. I think given that public sector is going to be under strained finances, I think the private sector will step in a lot more. And we're seeing that across the world. We've seen that in Saudi Arabia, for example. We've seen that across the world, right? So we see the private sector step in more across the spectrum. So we'll see a lot of venture capital funding. We've already seen that go into edtech already. I think that will result in a lot of interesting technologies. We'll see more and more of artificial intelligence, augmented reality, virtual reality come in. Again, I know I'm talking about people who have access to the internet, but we will see those technologies come in. But if you look at the sort of almost break it down to student teacher level, at the student level, we'll see more access to learning anywhere you are, almost doesn't matter. At the teacher level, we'll see more digital literacy. And then overall, we'll see assessment, so more security around remote proctoring, etc. So I think there'll be lots of technology changes across the piece. But one thing I'm sure of is that we'll see greater private sector participation in education across the world.
And just to pick up on that, do you also see that we'll have to start to understand how to measure school standards in a different way, where children are learning from home or learning in different ways? How do you measure standards, assess school quality, with Ofsted or the other agencies that do that?
It's a great question, Mehul, and one I was going to talk about is that as you see this private sector participation increase, that also goes into online schooling, right? So we've seen Harrow and Pearson launch an pure online school. So the regulators and Department for Education in the UK, etc., they will step in to regulate some of these online schools. Currently, they've got a massive backlog because they haven't been able to go out to schools and assess these schools, right? So they've got a massive backlog to solve for. But by next year, you'll see more and more guidance from regulatory bodies on how to manage these online schools. And again, you'll see private providers come in as well. So organizations like COBIS, who credit British international schools, you will see them as well come up with very clear algorithms of how online schools will work. So absolutely, I think governments will step in next year on hybrid school as well as pure online schools.
Thank you. And Dr. Sungsup, if I could ask you the same question, please.
Thank you, Miho. I think 2020 will be remembered as an extraordinary turning point in the history of education, I would say. Education systems around the world face, I would say, unforeseen shocks from minimal preparedness. But 2021 presented also new opportunity in the form of the new budget that can be aligned with the new priority. So government will come up with a new budget, hopefully with more money. Leveraging this opportunity can bring out the evolutionary changes in education for the better. I have a few predictions, maybe 5. I think many of you already did it, so I will skip some of them. First, I would say shift in skill demand. Increased demand for the digital skill should shift priority to accelerate development of the digital competence. That would be very important. People start to realize the limit of the offline learning. COVID has likely caused the reversal of the gain made in education access and learning, as Miho, you mentioned at the beginning. And the current education system may fail to recover these losses. Though we talk about recovering losses, it's not easy. So there's likely to be shifted toward more contactless or untagged learning. Another one, I would say, missing middle. We talked about widening inequality as inevitable outcomes of the pandemic, given the disparity in access to the various modes of learning, and also between self-directed learner and the learner require support. But I see where's the middle then, just gone. How we address them? We talk about the learner, poor learner, and the remedial courses, but the people in the student in the middle, we don't talk about them. On a related note, remedial teaching to compensate for learning loss should be mainstreamed. This should bring a welcome shift from the focus on top performer to student lagging behind. Hopefully also in middle could address the issues of inequality. And then I think I saw one comment talking about importance of assessment. To be successful for the remedial teaching, we need a very good assessment tool to understand how much learning loss happened for each student. Equally important will be the need for the building self-directed ability among learners. This COVID-19 really telling us importance of self-directed learner. As I mentioned right ago, there's a big gap, or the widening gap between self-directed learner, and learners would require the support. These are some predictions I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sungsup. Some insightful predictions there. So we're nearing the end of our time. I just wanted to say that at the end of this, we will be sending out a white paper on some of the predictions and discussions that have happened. Perhaps, think of it as a blueprint for school recovery. If you haven't registered for this event, you'll see shortly on the ticker below a email address that you can use to send us an email, and we can make sure that you get a copy of the paper. So in summary, I'm just going to summarize this discussion in 2 simple sentences. That I think what has happened over the last 6 months is COVID has really been the catalyst for online and digital learning. I think we've finally reached that point that we've been talking about for so many years. And I think schools and teachers who haven't so far taken digital as seriously now really know why they need to. And I think that is going to make a huge difference and a huge change. As we discussed, the new normal is likely to stay for years. As the workplace changes, education will need to change to make students ready for the workplace. And so with that, can I say a very big thank you to our expert panel, Dr. Rani Birchmore from Microsoft, Ridwan Othman from NTT Data in Singapore, Dr. Sungsup Ra from the Asian Development Bank, and Vipul Bhargava from the UK's Department of International Trade. It's been a wonderful morning here, an afternoon there for you, and thank you so much for your insightful predictions, your advice. I know that we've had so many questions that we haven't answered specifically. I hope we can do that in the white paper that follows. But I also hope that this is the first of many such conversations, and that we carry on this discussion to make sure that we are, finding every possible way to, make education better as we go through this process. So, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who signed in and registered and logged in. We are grateful for your time, and thank you for being here. And have a good day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.